The prairie west of Harlan's Creek, Kansas, didn't forgive loneliness. It just made it bigger. By October of 1874, the grasslands had turned the color of old bone, and the wind that rolled off the Smoky Hill River carried a chill that settled into a man's chest long before winter made its formal arrival. The town itself, if a general store, a livery, a church missing half its steeple, and 14 scattered homesteads could be called a town, sat quietly at the edge of a world that asked hard questions every single day. Questions like, what are you willing to endure? And what will you trade to endure it less alone? Caleb Morrow had been asking himself those questions for 3 years. He was 34, broad-shouldered in the way that comes not from vanity but from years of splitting fence posts and hauling water before sunrise. His face was weather-worn and honest, the kind of face that gave nothing away and asked nothing in return. His homestead, 160 acres granted under the Homestead Act of 1862, sat 2 miles east of town, and it was good land. Hard land, but good. He had 2 horses, a working well, a barn he'd built himself, and a farmhouse with 4 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a silence so complete at night that it had started to feel like a second presence living there with him. That silence was the reason for the letter. He'd sent it in August, through a matrimonial agency operating out of St. Louis, one of the many that had begun advertising in frontier papers by the early 1870s, promising to match respectable Western men of means with genteel women of good character seeking a purposeful life. He had written his specifications plainly, the way he did everything. A woman between 25 and 35, accustomed to domestic life, willing to work beside him, capable of managing a household without requiring the comforts of city life. He had not written about loneliness. He was not a man who wrote about what he needed. He wrote only about what he expected. The agency wrote back in September. A match had been found. Her name was listed as Miss Clara Hennessy, formerly of Cincinnati, Ohio. 28 years old. Described as quiet, domestic, and well-suited to frontier life. She would arrive by stagecoach on the 15th of October. Caleb had told no one in town about the arrangement, not because he was ashamed, but because Harlan's Creek had the particular quality of small places everywhere. Everyone's business became everyone's opinion before the week was out, and he had no patience for opinions he hadn't asked for. But he had prepared. He'd mended the front porch. He'd ordered a new iron stove from the hardware catalog. He'd even bought a small mirror for the bedroom wall, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because it occurred to him, for the first time in years, that someone else would be looking at those rooms. He was standing outside the stage depot on the morning of October 15th, hat in hand, when the coach pulled in from the east. 3 passengers stepped off. The first was a drummer with a sample case and tired eyes. The second was an older man Caleb didn't recognize. And the third was a woman who stepped down from that coach like she had somewhere to be, a leather satchel over one shoulder and a crate of books tucked under her arm, and she looked at Harlan's Creek the way a schoolteacher looks at a classroom that's been left too long without one. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what she was. Her name was not Clara Hennessy. Her name was Nora Ellis. And the agency, as Caleb would learn shortly, had made what they would later call, in writing with visible embarrassment, a clerical error of considerable magnitude. Stay with me. Because what happened between Caleb Morrow and Nora Ellis over the weeks that followed is the kind of story this Prairie kept quiet for a long time, and it deserves to be told right. The confusion was sorted out with remarkable efficiency, given how thoroughly it appended everything. Nora Ellis had not applied to a matrimonial agency. She had applied, through a separate St. Louis office, for a teaching position being offered by the newly established Harlan's Creek School Board, a body that consisted, at that point, of 3 men, and a resolution passed in June that the town's 11 children deserved proper schooling before another winter made them housebound and idle. The teaching contract had been arranged. A small stipend had been promised. A boarding arrangement with the widow Hargrove, 2 blocks from what would eventually become a schoolhouse, had been secured. What had not been secured, what no one had thought to check, was whether the 2 St. Louis offices shared a filing clerk. They did. His name was apparently Gerald. Gerald had mixed up the correspondence. Caleb learned all of this in approximately 9 minutes, standing on the platform while the stagecoach driver handed down a trunk and Nora Ellis explained the situation in clear, unambiguous sentences that made it obvious she was used to being the most organized person in any room she entered. "I'm not your intended, Mr. Morrow," she said, and her voice carried no cruelty, only fact. "I'm the new schoolteacher. I'm sorry if the agency's error caused you inconvenience. I expect it caused you more than that." He looked at her for a moment. The books, the satchel, the steady eyes that didn't drop when they met his, and he said only, "Where's the actual Miss Hennessy?" "Still in Cincinnati, I'd imagine. I passed through St. Louis 2 weeks ago." The agent there seemed very embarrassed. "He assured me a correction had been sent." No correction had arrived. Caleb put his hat back on. He picked up her trunk, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was sitting in the mud and he was standing right there, and carried it to the widow Hargrove's front walk without another word. That was the end of the introduction. And in a different story, it would have been the end of everything between them. But Harlan's Creek was small. The schoolhouse the board had commissioned was unfinished. The far wall still needed framing, and the pot-bellied stove that had been ordered from Wichita had not arrived. The 11 children who needed teaching were not waiting politely. And the man on the school board who had agreed to finish the construction, a rancher named Deacon Pruitt who ran 400 head on the south side of the creek, had decided, upon learning the new teacher was a single woman from Ohio with opinions, that the schoolhouse could wait until spring. Nora Ellis stood in front of that half-built structure on her third day in Harlan's Creek and assessed it the way she assessed everything, plainly, without drama, with a list already forming in her mind. She needed lumber. She needed labor. She needed the stove. She needed, in other words, someone who knew how to build things and wasn't already under Deacon Pruitt's thumb. The widow Hargrove, a woman who missed nothing and said less than she knew, mentioned over breakfast the following morning that Caleb Morrow had built his own barn from raw timber in under 3 weeks, and that he was the only man in the county who had refused to graze his cattle on Pruitt's terms. Nora set down her coffee cup. "Does he owe Pruitt anything?" she asked. "Not a cent," said the widow. "That's exactly why Pruitt can't stand him." Now here is what the town of Harlan's Creek understood about those two people. Caleb Morrow was still technically waiting for a bride. Nora Ellis was the woman who had accidentally taken her place. And if there was one thing that a small frontier town in Kansas in 1874 understood deeply, it was that those two people should stay as far apart as possible, or the gossip would never end. Which is precisely why what happened next was so perfectly, stubbornly, inevitably human. Nora walked to Caleb Morrow's homestead on a Thursday morning with a pencil behind her ear and a list in her hand, and she knocked on the door like she had every right in the world to be there. Because she decided she did. He didn't open the door right away. She heard movement inside, boots on a wood floor, the sound of something being set down, and then a pause that lasted just long enough to make clear that he had recognized her knock for what it was. Not an emergency, not a neighbor, but an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted for. When he did open the door, he was holding a hammer. Not threateningly. Just the way a man holds a tool when he was in the middle of using it and didn't expect company. "Miss Ellis," he said. "Mr. Morrow." She held up the list. "I need your help. I'll pay you for your time." He looked at the list without taking it. "I'm not looking for work." "I know. You're a homesteader. But I'm told you built your barn yourself, which means you know framing, and the schoolhouse needs a west wall before December or those children will be learning their letters in someone's parlor." She lowered the list. "Deacon Pruitt controls every hired hand in a 10-mile radius. You're the only man in this town who doesn't answer to him." Something moved in his expression. Not softness, exactly. Recognition, maybe. "Who told you that?" he asked. "Does it matter?" He looked at her for a long moment. The prairie wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain. "What are you paying?" he said finally. "Whatever the school board agreed to pay for the original contractor, minus the cost of materials, which I've already sourced." She handed him a second paper, a breakdown, itemized, with the lumber measurements and nail counts written in a schoolteacher's precise hand. "I've also written to the supplier in Wichita about the stove. It'll arrive by the end of the month if they honor the contract." He studied the paper for a moment. Then he said, You wrote to the supplier yourself? I did. What did you tell them? That the school board had engaged them in good faith, that the original delivery date had passed, and that if they wished to maintain a commercial relationship with this region going forward, they might consider honoring their commitments. She paused. Politely worded, of course. He looked up at her then, really looked at her, and she held his gaze without flinching, because that was simply how she was made. I'll come by the site tomorrow morning, he said. 7 o'clock. 6:30 would be better, she said. The light is better early. He almost smiled. She wasn't certain, but she thought he almost did. What neither of them acknowledged, what the widow Hargrove would have had no trouble naming, had she been there to see it, was that something had shifted in that exchange. Not between a man and a woman, not yet. Between two people who recognized, without wanting to, that the other one operated according to a code worth respecting. That was the most dangerous kind of beginning. By the end of the first week, Caleb had framed the west wall. He arrived at 6:30 each morning without complaint, worked until the light failed, and said exactly what was necessary and nothing more. Nora arrived each morning with coffee in a tin pot and her own set of tasks, measuring, cataloging, organizing the donated readers and slates that had come in from church families. And she, too, said exactly what was necessary and nothing more. The children started the second week, in the half-finished room with sawdust still on the floor. Caleb would look up occasionally from the outside framing and hear her voice through the planks, steady, clear, unsentimental, reading to 11 children who had gone quiet in that particular way children go quiet when someone is saying something worth listening to. He noticed. He did not say so. On the Friday of the second week, one of the younger boys, 6 years old, a Swede's son named Arn, wandered outside during a lesson and stepped squarely into a nail that had been left in the dirt, head up, by a careless moment Caleb hadn't caught. The boy sat down hard and began to cry the way small children cry when they're frightened as much as hurt. Caleb was down off the ladder before he knew he'd moved. He checked the foot, removed the nail. It was shallow, not dangerous, wrapped it with a strip of cloth from his own shirt pocket, and set the boy on his feet with a steadiness that left no room for continued panic. You're all right, he said quietly. It's just a scratch. You're all right. The boy sniffled, looked up at the big man crouching in the dirt beside him, nodded. Nora had come to the door. She watched all of it without speaking. When Caleb looked up and found her eyes, she said simply, "Thank you." 2 words. But the way she said them, without surprise, without performance, told him something. She hadn't expected him to be unkind. She had simply been glad he was there. He didn't know what to do with that. So he went back to work. By the 3rd week of October, Harlan's Creek had formed its opinion. Small towns do not wait for evidence. They wait for enough information to build a narrative, and once that narrative is built, it is load-bearing, impossible to remove without the whole structure coming down. And the narrative the town had built around Caleb Morrow and Nora Ellis was this: that man sent for a bride, got a schoolteacher instead, and now he's spending his mornings at her schoolhouse because he doesn't know how to give up on a thing. It was partly true, which made it harder to argue with. The woman who gave the narrative its sharpest edge was Mabel Pruitt, Deacon Pruitt's wife, a woman whose virtues were real but whose tolerance for other people's irregular arrangements was not. She said it first at the general store, in the particular tone that turns observation into verdict. It's not proper, she told the storekeeper's wife. A single man spending every morning at a single woman's schoolhouse. And her barely 6 weeks arrived and already managing the men of this town like she's been here 20 years. The storekeeper's wife said nothing, which in Harlan's Creek counted as agreement. By the end of the week, the sentiment had traveled. 2 families pulled their children from the school, not permanently, they said, just until the situation was clarified. One of the school board members, a man named Hobbs who had never had an opinion that didn't first pass through Deacon Pruitt's kitchen, suggested that perhaps Miss Ellis's contract should be reviewed. Caleb heard about it from the widow Hargrove, who told him with the directness of a woman who considered vagueness a moral failing. They're using her reputation to pressure her into leaving, the widow said. If she leaves, the school closes. If the school closes, Pruitt keeps control of this town's children's futures, which means he keeps control of this town. Caleb said nothing. She hasn't asked for help, the widow added. But she's also the kind of woman who wouldn't. He knew that already. What he didn't know, what he found out on a gray Wednesday morning when he arrived at the schoolhouse at his usual 6:30 to find the door already open and Nora Ellis sitting on the front step with a letter in her hand, was how much had already been taken from her before she ever arrived in Kansas. He almost walked past. Instead, he stopped. "Bad news?" he asked. She folded the letter. "The board is reviewing my contract. Hobbs says there are concerns about my..." She paused, and the pause was doing a great deal of work. "My conduct." "Your conduct," he repeated. "Apparently," she said, "a schoolteacher who accepts help from an unmarried man to build her schoolroom has demonstrated insufficient regard for appearances." She looked up at him. Her voice was even. Her hands were still. "The irony is not lost on me that the man whose reputation is at the center of the concern has not had his contract reviewed." Caleb stood in the cold morning air and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, exactly. Something older and more specific. The particular kind of outrage that comes from watching something decent be made to look indecent by people with the power to make things look however they choose. "What will you do?" he asked. "Beach," she said. "Until they lock the door." She stood, straightened her coat, and went inside. He picked up his tools. And then Deacon Pruitt rode up on his bay horse, unhurried, with the confidence of a man who owned 1,100 acres and several other men's debts. "Morrow," he said from the saddle. Caleb looked up. "Might be wise to let this particular project go," Pruitt said. He smiled, the way men smile when they already know the outcome. "The board's going to make a decision regardless. Don't make it harder on yourself." Caleb held the man's gaze for exactly as long as it took to make clear he wasn't hurrying. "I'll be done with the west wall by Thursday," he said. "The stove installs Friday." Pruitt's smile didn't change. "Suit yourself," he said, and rode away. Which was what made him dangerous. Not rage, but patience. He was a man who could afford to wait. The question was whether Caleb could afford not to act. The letter from the school board arrived on a Monday. It was not a termination, not yet. It was what Hobbs called a formal notice of concern, which meant that the board would convene on Friday to assess the circumstances surrounding Miss Ellis's continued suitability for the position. She was not required to appear. She was, however, required to have vacated the schoolroom by Thursday evening if the vote went against her. Nora read it twice. Then she set it on the table and poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the widow Hargrove's kitchen window and looked at the October sky, which was the color of iron and making promises about the weather that Kansas always kept. "What will you do?" the widow asked. "I'll write to the agency in St. Louis," Nora said. "There may be another placement by spring." "That's not what I asked." Nora turned from the window. "I know." The truth she had not said out loud to anyone, was that she had not come to Kansas because she had nowhere else to be. She had come because she had been somewhere else for a long time, and that somewhere had gradually, politely, and completely made clear that it had no room for a woman who taught in ways that made the school board uncomfortable and asked questions that made administrators uncomfortable and refused, repeatedly, to make herself smaller so that rooms full of important men could feel larger. Cincinnati had been her home. Cincinnati had also, in the end, decided it preferred a different kind of schoolteacher. She had thought, coming west, that a frontier town would be different, that a place still being built might have room for someone who knew how to build things. She had been, perhaps, too hopeful. On Tuesday morning, she went to the schoolhouse anyway. She taught. All 11 children came, including the 2 whose families had briefly pulled them. Arn, the Swede's boy, sat in the front row and worked through his sums with the focused silence of a child who has decided that learning is the most serious enterprise available to him. Nora watched him and felt the particular grief of a teacher who knows she may not see a student all the way through. On Wednesday, Caleb came as usual. He finished the interior trim on the west wall, planed the door so it closed cleanly in the frame, and fixed a crack in the floor planking near the back. He didn't mention the letter. She didn't mention it either. When he was putting his tools away at the end of the day, he said, without turning around, "Are you going to the board meeting Friday?" "I wasn't invited," she said. "That wasn't the question." She paused. I thought I'd make it easy for them, she said finally. Deacon Pruitt is going to win. He has the votes and the money and the patience. Fighting it publicly makes it harder to get placed somewhere else. If I disappear quietly, they'll feel magnanimous about it, and I keep the reference letter. Caleb turned around. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that very first morning, like he was measuring something, and the measurement mattered. That's a sound argument, he said. I know. It's also the thing they want you to do. The words weren't loud. They weren't even meant to wound. But they landed. She looked at her hands. Then out the window at the schoolyard, where the dirt still held the impressions of children's boots from the morning. Then back at him. I don't know what the alternative is, she said quietly. Standing up in a room full of men who've already decided and making a speech accomplishes nothing except making me feel righteous and costing me my career. I'm not suggesting a speech, he said. Then what? He picked up his tool bag. He said, come to the meeting. Just come. You don't have to say a word. He walked out. She stood in the schoolroom that she had watched take shape board by board, with the pot-bellied stove finally settled in the corner and the children's slates stacked neatly on the shelf she'd asked him to build in the third week, and she did not cry. That was not how she was made. But she stayed there in the quiet for a long time. Stay with me, because what happened at that board meeting on Friday is the part of this story that nobody in Harlan's Creek forgot. Not for years. Not ever. The Harlan's Creek School Board convened on Friday evening in the back room of the general store, as it always did, at 7 o'clock. By 6:50, every adult in town had found a reason to be somewhere in the general store's vicinity. This was not unusual. Frontier communities did not have theaters. When something real was about to happen, they showed up. Deacon Pruitt sat at the table with Hobbs on one side and a third board member, a quiet farmer named Aldrich who usually voted however the room felt, on the other. The case against Nora Ellis was not complicated, as Pruitt had designed it. Conduct unbecoming a schoolteacher. Failure to maintain appropriate social distance. A generally irregular arrangement that reflected poorly on the community. Nora came in at 7:05. She sat in the back row. She had brought nothing, no papers, no written argument. Just herself, in her good gray dress, with her hands folded in her lap and her posture exactly as it always was, straight, still, refusing to apologize for existing. Caleb was not there. The meeting opened. Hobbs read the formal notice. Pruitt spoke at measured, genteel length about community standards and the importance of propriety in those who shaped young minds. Aldrich looked at the table. The room murmured. Two women near the front nodded. The widow Hargrove, sitting beside Nora, did not move a muscle. Then the door opened. Caleb Morrow walked in, and behind him, in a loose, unpracticed group, came 6 men. Homesteaders, mostly. Men who worked their own land and owned their own debt and therefore answered to no one in that room. Sven Lindqvist, Arnie's father. Old Chester Mays, who'd been in the territory since '62. 2 brothers named Fowler who ran cattle on the North Ridge and hadn't agreed on a single thing in 15 years. A young man named Tomas Reyes who'd proved up his claim the year before. And Thomas Birch, the Methodist minister, who walked in last and stood quietly near the wall. Pruitt looked up. This is a closed meeting, Morrow. The school board's charter says meetings are open to parents of students enrolled, Caleb said. He looked at Sven Lindqvist. Arnie's a student? Ja, said Sven. Chester's grandkids enrolled? They are, said Chester. Pruitt's jaw tightened. What is the meaning of this? Caleb walked to the front of the room. He held his hat in his hands, the way he'd held it the morning the stagecoach came in, and he addressed the board the way he did everything, directly, without performance. I'm here to correct a misunderstanding, he said. The concerns raised about Miss Ellis's conduct involve me. I was the one who went to her. I asked her to let me finish the schoolhouse, not because of any arrangement, not because of anything she said or asked for, but because it needed doing and I was able to do it. He paused. She didn't compromise her propriety. She taught school. I built a wall. Those are separate things. Morrow, this isn't, Pruitt began. I'm also here to tell you, Caleb continued, and his voice didn't rise, didn't harden, just continued with the patient certainty of a man who has thought this through, that I'll be withdrawing my cattle from the Prairie grazing arrangement this spring. I know 3 other men in this room who are thinking the same thing. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. I'm not saying that as a threat. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you ought to know that the people in this room have choices, and they're paying attention to how their choices get made. The room was very quiet. Aldrich looked up from the table. He looked at Nora Ellis, sitting in the back row. Then he looked at Prairie. Then he said, "I'd like to table the review." Prairie said, "Aldrich, I'd like to table it," Aldrich said again. "Unless you've got objection." Hobbs said nothing. Prairie looked at the room. He looked at the minister near the wall. He looked at old Chester Mays, who was watching him with the mild, unintimidated expression of a man who had outlasted harder winters than this one. "Tabled," Prairie said. His voice was flat. "For now." Caleb nodded once. He put his hat back on. He looked at Nora Ellis across the full length of that room. She looked back at him. She did not smile. She didn't need to. But her hands, which had been still and folded in her lap through the entire meeting, opened slowly and settled flat on her knees. It was the most honest thing she'd shown him. He walked out. The 6 men followed. The widow Hargrove leaned over and said, very quietly, "Well." November came to Harlan's Creek like it always did, without apology, and with every intention of staying. The school did not close. The 2 families who had pulled their children brought them back by the 2nd week. Aldrich's wife enrolled their youngest, a girl named Pearl who had been kept home on the grounds that the school wasn't ready, which was no longer true, by any measure. Even Mabel Prairie was quiet on the subject, at least in public, which in a town this size meant something. Deacon Prairie did not make another direct move. That was not his style. But he reduced the terms on 3 of the homesteaders who grazed cattle on his land, and when Caleb followed through on withdrawing his arrangement, Prairie made sure it was known that Morrow's land would receive no favorable consideration if a drought year came and water rights became a negotiation. Caleb noted this and continued. The relationship between him and Nora Ellis did not change overnight. That is the important thing to understand. There was no declaration on the steps of the schoolhouse, no dramatic shift in the temperature between them. What happened was smaller and more durable than that. He still came by the schoolhouse, but less often now, and for different reasons, to fix a hinge, to check the stove's draft, to leave a cord of firewood stacked against the east wall without making a production of it. She still spoke to him the way she had from the beginning. Plainly, without pretense, with the clear-eyed courtesy of a woman who had learned to be grateful for the people who showed up rather than the people who promised to. One afternoon in mid-November, a gray Thursday with the smell of early snow in the air, he was stacking the last of the firewood when she came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without being asked. They stood on the schoolhouse steps and drank in silence for a while. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. Why did you come to that meeting?" The honest reason. He thought about it. He wasn't a man who gave easy answers to questions that deserved real ones. "Because you were right," he said finally. "You were doing your job and they were going to take it from you because it was convenient. And I was part of the reason they had the excuse." She looked at him. "That's a practical reason." "It is. Was there another one?" He looked out at the prairie, the flattened November grass, the pewter sky, the long silence that was Kansas in the cold season. "You stayed," he said, "when a smarter person would have walked. You came to that meeting and you sat down in the back of the room knowing they were going to vote against you and you sat there anyway." He paused. "I don't know many people who do that." She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't know me 6 weeks ago," she said. "No," he agreed. "You'd ordered a different woman." "I had." He turned to look at her. Something in his expression was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "I ordered someone I thought I needed. That's a different thing." The snow started that evening, light and early, and by morning the schoolyard was white and smooth and full of small boot prints where the children had arrived, as they always did, because Nora Ellis had built the kind of classroom children didn't want to miss. Caleb Morrow watched from the road. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. He didn't stop, but he didn't look away either. In December, he asked her if she would take supper at the homestead on Christmas Day. Not as a proposition, not in the transactional sense that had started all of this. As one person asking another person if they were willing to share a table on a long winter day. She said yes. The widow Hargrove, when told, said, "About time," which is the kind of thing you can say when you were right from the beginning. Here is what the Prairie keeps. Not the big things, not the names carved into county records, not the deeds filed in Wichita, not the formal history that gets cleaned up and straightened out in the telling. The Prairie keeps the small things. The boot prints in the first snow. The cord of firewood left without ceremony. The cup of coffee handed over a threshold. The moment a man walks into a room full of people who have already made up their minds and says the true thing anyway, not loudly, not heroically, just clearly, because some things deserve to be said out loud. Caleb Morrow had come to Kansas with one kind of plan. He was not the first man on the frontier to learn that the plan was the wrong shape for the life waiting to be lived. The Homestead Act had brought thousands of men west with contracts and expectations and lists of what they needed, and the land had a habit, as local accounts tell it, of substituting what they actually needed instead, often without asking permission. He had written a letter asking for a wife. What arrived was a woman who knew herself so well that he had to learn to know himself better just to be in the same room with her. Nora Ellis had come west believing that a new place might have room for the kind of woman she'd already decided to be. She had been right, though not in any of the ways she'd anticipated. The room had not been given to her. It had been built, board by board, in the cold mornings, by a man she had every practical reason to resent and no good reason to trust. She had trusted him anyway. That's the thing about courage. It rarely arrives as a grand gesture. It arrives as a decision made on a Thursday morning, or a Friday evening, or on the step of a half-finished schoolhouse in October, when someone makes the quiet choice to stay when it would be easier and safer and smarter to go. The school at Harlan's Creek went on. Arne Lindqvist, the Swede's boy, learned to read that winter, all the way through, and by spring he was helping the younger children with their letters. Aldrich's daughter Pearl turned out to have a particular gift for arithmetic that none of the grown men on the school board would have ever discovered if the school had been closed in November. The building lasted, with ongoing repairs as such buildings do, for 11 years, until a larger schoolhouse was built in 1885 on the same plot. Deacon Pruitt retained his land and his influence, as men like that usually do. But the town's memory is longer than one man's power, and as local accounts suggest, the people of Harlan's Creek remembered, in the way that small communities remember what defines them, that on a Friday evening in October of 1874, a group of men walked into a room to stand for a schoolteacher they barely knew, because she had given their children something worth standing for. As for Caleb and Nora, the story passed down is not one of sudden, certain love. It is one of two people who recognized each other slowly, honestly, and against every expectation they'd carried west with them. He had wanted something manageable, someone to share the work, to quiet the silence in those 4 rooms. What he found was someone who asked better questions than he was used to answering, and who stayed when the answers didn't come easy, and who showed him, without ever making a speech about it, that the life worth building is almost never the life you planned. And she, who had come west prepared to stand alone, found that the most unexpected gift the frontier could offer was not security, or position, or the fight she'd been preparing to win for years. It was someone who showed up every morning at 6:30, without being asked.